In our episodes, we discuss cases and topics that might be distressing or disturbing to some listeners. Listener discretion is advised. And welcome back to another episode of Cardinal Crimes. Today we are going to be diving into part 2 of our coverage of the death of Anthony Mitchell. Last week we introduced Anthony Mitchell. He was a man from Jasper, Alabama, who was arrested on January 12th, 2023. We talked about the circumstances surrounding his arrest, and we talked about what the doctor said about his overall health on the day he died, which was 14 days after arriving at the Walker County Jail. Anthony Mitchell died of hypothermia and sepsis. The coroner ruled his death a homicide. We also talked about the horrific conditions that Anthony Mitchell was forced to endure while in custody, and how correctional officers and other staff purposefully left him in inhumane conditions for their own personal gain. We talked about the prevailing culture in the jail and how many staff members refused to provide Tony with care for fear of job repercussions. Today, we are going to talk about the hours leading up to Anthony Mitchell's death, and then we're going to dive into how exactly this story made it to a national stage. If you have not listened to part 1, go back and do that so that you can get a full understanding of what is going on here. But let's dive back in to the evening of January 25th, the day before Anthony Mitchell dies. The Mitchell family civil suit states, on the evening of January 25th, 2023, the night before individual number 1 died, jailer number 1 and Gainey opened BK5 to check on individual number 1's welfare since he appeared to be in physical distress. Defendant Haney looked in on individual number 1 and found him to be lying on the floor, largely unresponsive, and only able to raise his head and mutter incoherently. But he was not responding to any of Defendant Laney's efforts to get him to raise himself up. In response, Defendant Haney expressed frustration at individual number 1 and dismissed his obvious needs and took no steps to help him. We have talked about the inhumane conditions that Anthony Mitchell was forced to endure in cell BK5, which, if you recall from part 1, is not a cell meant for the long-term housing of an inmate. It's a booking cell. So someone is only supposed to be in there temporarily. I also want to mention, in the family civil suit, it claims that the last time Tony was observed being given water was on January 23rd around 4:30 in the morning. So we are over 2 days later. He has had no water. He's in this cell. It's freezing. During the night of January 25th to the 26th, the temperatures outside got to the low 30s Fahrenheit, and according to the civil suit, the correctional officers intentionally caused cold air to blow through the roof vents into the other booking cells. It was so cold that apparently another inmate being held in a separate booking cell began shaking uncontrollably, and she repeatedly told officers it was freezing in her cell and she needed to warm up, and they either just completely ignored her, or in the civil suit it says they just told her to live with it. Now, the cell that Tony was in, BK5, was known as the coldest cell in the booking area and was referred to by officers and inmates as the freezer. At 3:30 in the morning on January 26th, Braxton Key, a correctional officer, opened the cell door holding a bag of food. He shined a light in on Tony, and another officer, Denzel Mitchell, approaches the cell. About 5 minutes later, Denzel brings a cup of water to the cell, the first water that Tony had been provided in over 70 hours. But Tony appears to be too weak to even sit up or drink it. Key can be seen yanking Tony up by the wrist, but he can't sit up, and he slumps back onto the ground. Shortly after this, Key and Jacob Smith, another correctional officer, roll in a vital signs machine. Key's report states, quote, Officer Key noted the inmate looked pale. Officer Key and Smith took inmate's blood pressure, checked heart rate and oxygen level. After the oxygen level and heart rate read low, Officer Key notified Captain Tidwell and medical staff. Medical staff arrived at approximately 4:17 a.m. At this time, around 4 a.m., 4:17 a.m., multiple individuals, including correctional officers and a nurse practitioner, can be seen on surveillance video just standing around outside of the cell. And they appear to just be standing around and talking and laughing. And while they're doing this, Anthony Mitchell is lying motionless and naked on the cement floor. According to a civil suit, a supervisor is also present while all of this is happening. Now, a nurse practitioner enters the cell and is in there for about 2.5 minutes. Her notes from jail medical records said that Anthony Mitchell was cool to the touch and noted that she was unable to obtain blood pressure due to dehydration and cold temperature. She also recorded the following: asleep in fetal position, cool to the touch, difficult to arouse, but eyes open to command. No verbal communication. He moans and mumbles. Emaciated, naked, redness, petecia, I don't know how to pronounce that, noted on multiple areas of the skin and bruising on joints. Laying on left side, bruising on right arm visible. Mild edema in right hand. She wrote, inmate needs to be sent out to ER due to dehydration. So this nurse practitioner wrote that. Correctional officers, however, said that this nurse practitioner told them it would be okay to wait to move Tony until the start of the next shift, which didn't begin for another 2 hours. So now, 2 hours later at 6 a.m., someone named Morgan Madison opens the cell door, stood looking at Tony, and then closes the door again. It appears, though, around this time, around 6 a.m., according to the civil suit, a nurse, I'm not sure who, began expressing in clear terms, in no uncertain terms, that Tony would die if he was not taken to the hospital. The civil suit states the following. At the beginning of his shift on January 26, 2023, around 6 a.m., co-conspirator number 5 told defendant Jones that a nurse had seen individual number 1 and ordered that he be transported to a hospital and that the transport should take place as soon as possible. The same message was conveyed by other officers to co-conspirator number 2, who I know from a news article is an officer named Benjamin Shoemaker. So officers were insistent on telling Shoemaker that the nurse said individual number 1 could die if he wasn't taken to the hospital. Shoemaker dismissed these concerns outright, and the second time they came back to him and were like, you need to take him to the hospital, he apparently replied, quote, I'll tell you what, next time you're on the toilet taking a shit, I'll call you to bother you with something unimportant. Shoemaker told investigators that he had contacted another person about the plan to transport Mitchell and was concerned that if Mitchell was sent out of the jail, the abuse of him might come to light. Apparently, this person told Shoemaker not to send Mitchell to the hospital and that she was going to send another officer to the jail with protein shakes for him instead. Even though this was not normal protocol to give an inmate a protein shake rather than bring him to the hospital, especially when a nurse is literally saying that he could die if you don't take him. Around 6:30 a.m., Shoemaker and Morgan Madison can be seen entering the cell with a sleeping mat. And a short time later, another correctional officer is seen entering with a blanket. This is the first time Anthony Mitchell has had a sleeping mat since January 15th, and it's the first time he's had a blanket since the 13th. Now, around the same time, a nurse named Brad Allred stood at the door of the cell looking in at Tony, but again provided no treatment. Maybe 10 minutes later, instead of calling an ambulance, Shoemaker and Madison began sweeping trash out of the room and mopping around Tony as he lay on the floor. And we talked about this in part 1, but according to the civil suit, Anthony Mitchell's cell was only cleaned around 4 times during the 2 weeks he was there. And because of the nature of this cell, there was no toilet in it. There was a drain on the floor, but it was only suitable for liquid waste, not solids, and the liquid waste wouldn't even go down the drain unless a button outside of the cell was pushed. So now here we see 2 people sweeping out, cleaning out Tony's cell. He's been in there with urine and feces on the ground, just sitting in pure filth. Around this same time, an officer is seen entering the cell with cups of water, or the suit says perhaps a protein shake, but Tony is still too weak to drink anything and probably still unresponsive at this point. Around 7:45 a.m., Morgan Madison enters the cell carrying an orange jail uniform. Almost an hour later, at 8:30, Shoemaker rolls in with a wheelchair. So he brings a wheelchair into this cell, and he, along with help from others, bring Tony out of the cell in a wheelchair. Now, when he comes out, he is wearing that orange jail uniform, and this is the first time in around 2 weeks of detention that Tony was seen clothed. Now, very soon after they wheeled Anthony Mitchell out of the cell in this wheelchair, he falls out of the chair and onto the floor. Officers lift him back up into the chair, and Tony appears to be making slow and kind of spastic movements. So they put Tony back into the chair, but right around this time, a new female detainee is brought into the booking area for processing. So they actually carry Tony back into the cell. And I want to emphasize again, right? No one has called an ambulance. This is now 2 hours after a nurse told officers in no uncertain terms that Tony would die if he wasn't brought to a hospital. Even after this detainee is booked, officers can be seen standing around and talking outside of the cell. They're showing absolutely no sense of urgency for Tony, who is literally dying. Finally, at 8:54 a.m., 4 officers bring Tony out again. And this is the moment that really brought this case to the spotlight. The officers carry Tony through the door to the Sally Port and place him in the back of an SUV to drive him to the hospital. Now, they chose to transport Tony to the hospital themselves using a transport officer who reportedly lived a distance from the jail, and they did this instead of calling an ambulance when they knew he was dying. So the moment that everyone sees, and the moment that this really came to the national stage, was because the video of the officers carrying Tony out to the SUV eventually gets leaked and goes on social media. And we will talk about that here in just a minute. But the video showing them carrying Tony to the SUV, it's really hard and disturbing to watch. He is limp. He is not moving at all. He's completely unresponsive and his feet are shackled. Officers carry him on either side, and they hold him by the jail uniform at the shoulder and at the hips. As they get near the SUV, they lay Tony on the ground and they let his head fall on the cement while they stand around and talk. Eventually, they lift up Tony's body and put him in the back seat. Officers arrive at the hospital at 9:23 a.m. This is over 5 hours after taking his vitals around 4 a.m. and being instructed clearly that he needed to go to the hospital. Multiple officers who transported Anthony Mitchell made false statements claiming that Tony was awake and alert and responsive when they transported him. Everything they claim, though, goes directly against what is clearly seen in the surveillance video. Tony immobile and responsive. Tony immobile and unresponsive. And it goes against what the medical professionals at the hospital said about Tony's state. Now, let's revisit what the Walker County Jail put out as a statement after Tony died. Quote, "On Thursday, January 27th, an inmate in the Walker County Jail was provided with a routine medical check by jail medical staff. Medical staff determined the inmate needed to be transported to the hospital for further evaluation. The inmate was alert and conscious when he left the facility and arrived at the hospital. Shortly after arrival at the hospital, the inmate suffered a medical emergency and became unresponsive. Life-saving efforts were performed by hospital staff, and the inmate was ultimately revived. Unfortunately, a short time later, the inmate passed away." The staff at the Walker County Jail purposefully kept Tony in inhumane living conditions, forcing him to lie naked on a cement floor for days with no access to water or a toilet. he was forced to lie naked on the floor that was backed up with feces and urine. He was forced to eat food on that floor with his hands and without his teeth. He was forced to live in those conditions by jail staff for their own personal gain. Other staff refused to help Tony due to the prevailing culture in the jail. He never received proper medical or mental health evaluations, and the staff repeatedly refused to call an ambulance for him despite clear indications that he was dying. Staff members indicated they were afraid that bringing Tony in would bring to light the abuse they were inflicting on him. They delayed getting him care and refused to call an ambulance. After bringing him to the hospital, based on officer statements and the official statement published after Tony died, it is clear that they attempted to cover up their abuse and the delay in getting him medical attention by trying to document that Tony was alive and well and responsive when they left. They wanted to paint a picture that they provided this routine medical check, saw he needed help, and promptly brought him to the hospital. They wanted to scrub themselves of any blame and have a paper trail that would support that false narrative. But it was a lie, and it was a cover-up. So how did the public come to know the truth? It was only because of one correctional officer named Karen Kelly. Karen Kelly worked as a correctional officer at the Walker County Sheriff's Office and had worked there for over a year when all of this transpired. She worked on the night shift and was also part of the CIRT, or the Critical Incident Response Team, which, according to a suit she filed against the sheriff's office, means she would occasionally get called in to work for a shakedown of a dorm to search for contraband. What I read in the suit is that Kelly had actually recently just been promoted to a new position, which will become pertinent later on. So anyways, Kelly became aware of Anthony Mitchell after he had been arrested on January 12th, and she knew that he was being held in cell BK5. Kelly was told that Mitchell was in that cell because he was on suicide watch. And as we discussed in part 1, this was not the case. Although Anthony Mitchell's mother has said he had been suicidal in the past, there was never any documentation that he was suicidal during his incarceration or that he had been placed on suicide watch. According to the lawsuit, the last time Kelly saw Tony was at the end of her shift around 6 a.m. on January 25th, 2023. And according to the suit, at this time, Mitchell was sitting on the ground inside of his cell. The next day, as we know, Anthony Mitchell died after hours of being refused treatment by jail staff. Now, at some point after Anthony Mitchell's death, Kelly began hearing rumors in the community about what happened to Tony and the state that he was in when he was finally taken to the hospital. Kelly went to a Lieutenant Trina Phillips, who was one of her supervisors, and she brought up her concerns about what she was hearing about Mitchell's condition. According to the suit, Phillips told her to search around on the surveillance video to figure out what happened, as neither of them were working on the day that he died. So Kelly goes into the control room, wherever they keep all the surveillance video, and she's sifting through it, and she finds the recording from January 26th, just before 9 a.m., showing officers dragging Tony out to the Sally Port. Kelly actually records that video on either the 29th or the 30th. Remember, she works the night shift, so could have been bleeding over into one of those days. And she records this video on her cell phone and she sends it to Lieutenant Phillips. Kelly talks to Phillips about this, and she says that this video has been weighing on her. And they also discuss that if either of them had been working, they would have immediately called to get Tony help. Now, on the evening of the 30th, a local news station publishes a story about Anthony Mitchell's death. But at this point, what is being published is the statement from the Walker County Sheriff's Office saying that Tony was alert and conscious, brought to the hospital following a routine check, and that the emergency happened at the hospital and that he died there. So This is the point that the public learns that an inmate has died, but they don't know anything else, right? They just know what the Walker County Sheriff's Office has published. Karen Kelly, however, sees this statement and is surprised. She saw the surveillance video. She knows that Tony was not alert and conscious when he left the jail. She saw with her own eyes Tony was limp and being carried out. So at this point, she knows that the public affairs officer, Armstrong, has provided a false statement to the media, and she gathers it's to hide the fact that Mitchell was so close to death by the time he was brought to the hospital that he stood no chance of surviving. And seeing the surveillance video for Kelly initially was weighing on her, but now seeing the video, in combination with this false report that her department has put out about Anthony Mitchell's death, reportedly caused her such extreme emotional distress that she made the decision that she needed someone outside of the Walker County Sheriff's Office to see what had happened. So Karen Kelly sends this video to a corrections officer at another agency. Kelly wanted to be sure that someone outside of her own employer knew what happened, but Kelly was also concerned that the video itself would be deleted or recorded over. And she needed someone else to know, and she wanted to preserve the video. When Karen Kelly sent this video, she knew that doing so would risk her job, but she sent it anyway. The video naturally makes its way to social media, and quickly the community is seeing it and they are talking about it. Now, days later, on February 7th, 2023, during Kelly's night shift, an investigator and Officer Armstrong call Kelly up to the sheriff's office because they say they need to speak with her. My assumption is that Kelly understood this was not going to go well for her. She actually asked when she got there if she needed an attorney, and they said that she didn't because it was a, quote, in-house investigation. They told her, though, that she could have a witness there, so Kelly was like, let's get Lieutenant Phillips up here. I want her to be here while we have this conversation. Karen Kelly is told that it had come to their attention that a video had been leaked to the public. Armstrong shows her the video and asks if she recognized it. She said yes, and she said she had recorded a version of that video and had sent it to Lieutenant Phillips and someone outside of the agency. They asked her why she did this, and she said she wanted to share the truth of what happened to Anthony Mitchell as opposed to the cover-up that the department had clearly attempted. Now, they continue asking her questions about it, and she explains that she thought that they handled the entire situation completely wrong, and that if they had acted sooner or called an ambulance, Anthony Mitchell would still be alive. Now, at some point, the investigator starts to go through Kelly's phone. He's scrolling through the phone, he's looking at stuff. Officer Armstrong is leaning over, and they're both watching, just scrolling through her phone, and they keep questioning her about why she released the video. And another investigator then comes in, and this investigator is instructed to, quote, get everything off of the phone for them to review. Now, at this point, they tell Kelly, look, you can go back to work. We will bring you your phone back later. So Kelly and Phillips go back to the jail, and Kelly gets her phone back around 2 hours later. When she gets her phone back, she sees she has a missed call from her captain. And the captain said that she had just gotten off the phone with a jail administrator and that Kelly was to be sent home until the investigation into the video could be completed. Now, a day later, on February 9th, the leaked video that at first was just contained in the community has gone completely viral, and it's made its way to national news. An article from CBS had a title, quote, police said an Alabama man was alert and conscious when he left their jail. Video shows otherwise. The next day, on February 10th, a deputy from the Walker County Sheriff's Office, while wearing a body camera that he had turned on, hand-delivered a letter to Kelly with the subject at the top, termination of employment. The letter was signed by Sheriff Nick Smith and stated the following. Pursuant to the appropriate provisions of the Walker County Civil Service Act number 200, you are considered a probationary employee as you have not been an employee of the Sheriff's Department for 6 months. In other words, your probationary period has not been served. A probationary employee may be discharged for unsatisfactory service at any time before the expiration of the 6 months. You have engaged in certain activities that have been discussed with you, which are considered unsatisfactory service for a variety of reasons. I, therefore, have elected to discharge you as a probationary employee as provided for by Act number 200 of the Walker County Civil Service Act, effective immediately. If you remember, I said she had been recently promoted, and so I think that's why she was considered a probationary employee. In the civil suit, it kind of outlines like the time periods that she had worked there. It was like she worked there for a year, and then there was a gap in employment for reasons I'm not quite sure why, but then she came back and I think then was promoted. So whatever, she was considered a probationary employee, which is why they were able to terminate her. So Karen Kelly turns in all of her equipment, and that was that. After she was fired, another officer was moved into her position, and according to the suit, the officer they moved there was one of the ones that participated in the abuse of Anthony Mitchell. Now, over a year after Anthony Mitchell's death, his autopsy was finally completed. I don't know why it took so long, or if it had been done sooner, but the results just weren't released. But eventually it's released to the public that he died from hypothermia and sepsis, and his death was ruled a homicide. Now, multiple federal charges have been brought against members of the Walker County Jail, and at least 9 have pled guilty in these various cases and have admitted that their actions or lack of action contributed to Anthony Mitchell's death. Now, members of the community, after all of this came out, have really come together to demand justice and answers and accountability for what happened at the Walker County Jail. Local activists have held vigils, they've held protests, and they have been showing up at local city council meetings and other meetings with elected officials to demand change. And seeing all of these people coming together at a local level to demand change, it's really inspiring. And I think it serves as a reminder that we can get involved at so many different levels and we can really help make change in our communities. Like, you can do things in your states, you can do things in your communities, you can do things in your towns. It's so important to get involved. With Anthony Mitchell's story making national news, it was also brought to light that he was not the only inmate to have died while in custody there. No, an investigation by a local ABC News channel revealed that from 2015 to 2023, at least 13 inmates had died inside the jail. The article reads, which I will link below. The death of Walker County Jail inmate Tony Mitchell has renewed questions about past deaths at the county jail. Claims of inadequate health care and mental health treatment span years before images of Mitchell from inside the jail reached national media attention. One of those deaths was Autumn Harris, who died in custody at the Walker County Jail in 2018 after being there for just 3 weeks. Autumn Harris was originally arrested in June of 2018 for a theft of property charge. And this charge stemmed from an argument she had with someone over $40. Her autopsy report stated that Autumn Harris, 34 years old and considered otherwise completely healthy, died of pneumonia just 1 day before her court date. A healthy 34-year-old woman in jail for an issue stemming over $40 died of pneumonia while in custody. That is just absolutely insane. I want to back up though and look at this issue of people dying in custody from like a national perspective. According to Reuters, the US government does collect detailed data on who is dying in jails around the country, but that information is not available to the public. So Reuters conducted their own investigation in 2020 and found that from 2008 to 2019, at least 7,571 inmates died in U.S. jails. Many of those who died faced minor charges, and 2/3 of the inmates identified by Reuters, almost 5,000 people were never convicted of the charges they were being held on. Of the 7,571 deaths Reuters identify, most of them succumbed to illness. More than 2,000 took their own lives amid mental health breakdowns, with most of them waiting for their trial or even to just be indicted. And a growing number died of the effects of drugs and alcohol. In the United States, our criminal legal system and our society at large, we have a real problem with either being just completely indifferent to or dehumanizing those who are incarcerated or come in contact with our criminal legal system. Anthony Mitchell, in clear need of help, was treated as less than human. The culture in this one county jail was clear, so clear that some staff feared job repercussions for providing care to Tony, a human being deemed unworthy of it. The same attitudes that contributed to Anthony Mitchell's death are pervasive throughout prisons, throughout our jails, and throughout law enforcement nationwide. Incarcerated individuals are rarely treated with humanity or dignity. Our system rarely focuses on lifting individuals up and correcting behavior. We rarely focus on rehabilitation. In our system, you can be accused of a crime. Not convicted of a crime, just accused of a crime. And if you are poor, you could spend years of your life in prison before ever going to trial. Many lose their jobs, they are unable to care for their families, and they are now in a system that is not equipped to provide proper health care, mental health care, or substance use treatment. During my time working as an investigator for my county public defender's office, we had clients who were too poor to be able to bail out of jail, and they were there for years. And ultimately, a grand jury will come back and choose to not indict them on charges. So they were there, just merely accused of a crime, spending years of their life there, away from their families, without a job, with no access to proper health care, then to just be let out. I can't claim to even know where to begin with solving the problems of our system, but I know that Anthony Mitchell should be alive today. Autumn Harris should be alive today. The thousands of people who die in custody across the country should be alive today. They deserved better. And if our criminal legal system claims to be one of justice, it must do better. If you or someone you know struggles with substance use or mental health, help is available. I will link resources below, phone numbers you can call to a national helpline that helps to provide referrals to local treatment organizations, support groups, and community-based resources. Thank you all for listening, and I will see you next time. Thank you for listening to this episode of Cardinal Crimes. If you enjoyed it, please consider subscribing, giving us a 5-star review wherever you get your podcast, and sharing this episode with others. You can find us on TikTok, YouTube, and Instagram with the handle @CardinalCrimes, and you can send us any case suggestions, questions, or topics you would like covered there or to our email, cardinalcrimes@gmail.com. Until next time, friends, take care of each other and take care of yourself.